Hey, welcome to the channel where we show you how to put some prep in your step. Today, I want to talk about level of detail calculations. In a previous video, I talked about the aggregate step and sort of touched a little bit on level of detail. And so in this video, I want to get more into the level of detail, and we'll probably still touch back on the aggregate step to help in our understanding of it. So let's dive in. So I've connected to my data set here. I'm going to pull in the orders table, and I'm going to pull in a clean step. So this is the sample superstore data set, and as I mentioned in the aggregation video, the level of detail here is at the product level. So all of the information is tied to a product. I can use the aggregate step to change the level of detail of the entire data set, but if I want to aggregate one of these at a different level of detail without losing the granularity here, and without going through some extra steps, then I would use my LOD calculation. Now in Tableau Prep, the only LOD calculation available is going to be the fixed calculation, and that's because you're fixing it to a different granularity than what we have to work with in the data set. Include and exclude are not available in Tableau Prep because those really have to do with what's on your view in Tableau Desktop, the dimensions that are in the view, while this is Tableau Prep is just dealing with what's in your data set. So let's say I wanted to look at sales, but at the category level, but I don't want to change the level of the entire data set. So what I would do is I would create a calculation, and we'd say fixed at the category level, give me my sum of sales. Now, the aggregation function of sum, or if we were using min or max, that only works inside of a LOD in Tableau Prep because all of the aggregation is happening at the row level. So if you use a sum function, at the row level, there's nothing for Tableau Prep to sum. So you have to use an LOD to specify the level of detail that you need this aggregate function to work. So we're saying we want the sum of sales at the category level. So I'm going to call this category sales. And there we've got, so this for every row now, this column is going to represent the sales for the category, the sum of all of the sales, all of the rows that make up the sales for each category. So we could use that for like a percent of total calculation. And now we have this calculation or this aggregation in our data set without having to change the detail and the granularity of our data. And I could do a couple of different things with my LODs too. For example, if I wanted to see, okay, for this customer ID, when was their first order that they purchased? So I can create a new calculated field, and I can say fixed at my customer ID, give me the minimum order date. And so at the customer ID level of detail, I need the minimum order date for each customer. And so that would be my first order date. And so now I can see this customer for this order, this was when in November of 2020 was when this order happened, but this customer made their first order in October of 2019. Or if I wanted to, I could even change that up to say, let's do first order by subcategory. And so now I can put a few more dimensions in my LOD. So I could say fixed at the customer ID and the subcategory, give me my minimum order date. And so now the level of detail of this calculation is at the customer ID and subcategory level of detail. But when you're thinking about the way the aggregate step functions, this would be your group by. So I'm grouping by customer ID and subcategory, and this is my aggregation. So that's kind of another way to think about the level of detail calculations inside of Tableau Prep. To simplify it, you can think of your dimensions in the fixed side as your group by pane, and then this would be your aggregated fields pane. But we're only using the one aggregated field. So again, this is just saying for each combination of customer ID and subcategory, give me that minimum order date. And so now I can see, okay, so this customer's first order was in October of 2019, but their first order in the bookcases category was on November of 2020. Same thing for the chairs category. The first order for this customer in the chairs category was also in this same order, because there was two separate products here, one from each of those categories, and this was the first time that they ordered from those categories. So what this has really allowed me to do is it's kind of helped my understanding of LOD calculations inside of Tableau Desktop. Now I sort of think of them as the aggregate step, and it helps me sort of visualize what I'm trying to do when I'm making LOD calculations in Desktop. And you can do the same thing again with aggregate steps. So if I pull in an aggregate step here, and our first demonstration was category sales. So if I pull in category and pull in sales, so what this is doing is similar to the LOD calculation. So fixed at the category level, grouping by the category level, give me my sum of sales. And again, if we did the same sort of thing with the customer ID, so group by my customer ID, fixed at the customer ID level, what is the minimum order date? So I can drag order date to my aggregated fields and change my aggregation to minimum. So now this is the first order date for each customer ID. And we can take that a step further again and say, okay, well, grouping by each combination of this customer and this subcategory, what is my minimum order date? So fixed at the customer ID and subcategory level, what's the minimum order? So you can see how my grouped fields and my aggregated fields is structured very similarly to my calculated field here. If I pull that up, so grouping by customer ID and subcategory, minimum order date. Grouping by customer ID and subcategory, minimum order date. So again, you can achieve the same thing with either the aggregate step or the LOD calculation. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Do you need all of these details in your data, but you also need one of the pieces aggregated at a different level? Then the LOD is the way to go. And you're also kind of reducing the steps to tie that information back in. But we could also, if it's easier for our understanding, or maybe the way that we document our flows, it's easier to have these steps split out, keep any sort of different granular calculations inside of an aggregate step. That way it's easier to document. You can still bring that data back into your flow by joining it back in. So this is my minimum order by customer ID and subcategory. So I'm going to go in my clean step. I'm going to remove this field, and I'm going to pull it back in by joining the aggregate step. And I'm going to join on customer ID. And I'm also going to join on subcategory. All right. So now if I look at, let me pull on the clean step here and look at my list view. So now I know that this order date that was pulled in from the aggregate step is the first order by subcategory. And then these are duplicated fields since it's an inner join. And so now when I look back at my data set, so now when I go over here, I can see, okay, there's my first order by subcategory. So again, with LODs, we were able to do that just inside the clean step. But if we use the aggregate step, it allows us to sort of split that out, keep it separate. We can document that, document what sort of aggregation is happening in this step, and bring that data back into the flow. So it just depends, like I said, what are you trying to aggregate? Do you need all of the granular data, or do we just need this data that's in this step and to continue on with our flow with a higher level of detail, with less granularity, and maybe we don't need all of these details to end up in our final data set. So those are just a couple of different ways to understand aggregation, and level of detail calculations. And again, if you sort of think of level of detail calculations like this when you're using them in Tableau Desktop, it makes it easier for me when I think about it this way. So maybe that's something that you can start applying that'll make it easier, when you are using an LOD or when you think you might need to use an LOD. This could sort of help in that process. If there's other ways you'd like to see this or other use cases, just leave me some feedback, leave me some comments, and I hope to see you in the next one.